They sentenced the alien princess to the void, but a human held her hand through darkness. They said the sentence was mercy, but everyone who watched knew it was cruelty disguised as law, for when the alien princess stood in the great hall of her empire's tribunal, chains of radiant energy binding her slender wrists and luminous ankles, the entire chamber was bathed in a silence so cold it seemed to strip the air from the lungs of all present, and yet she held her head high, silver strands of her hair catching the pale light of the judgment fires, her eyes shimmering with defiance. Rather than despair, because she knew the truth of her trial, that it was never about guilt or innocence but about silencing a voice too dangerous for rulers built on lies, her crime being compassion, her defiance being mercy to enemies, and her punishment was exile into the void, a sentence reserved not for criminals but for those the Empire wanted to erase utterly, sending them adrift into the starless dark where no ship dared follow and no beacon could call for help, a fate worse than death. For it was living annihilation, and still she did not tremble, though around her the court of alien generals and dignitaries whispered with cruel satisfaction, their jeweled garments glinting like fangs in the light, while outside the glass walls of the tribunal hall 1,000 warships drifted in orbit above the cold pearl of their capital world, watching as though the spectacle of justice was itself an act of war, and in the shadows of that hall stood a human, one man in a place he did not belong, a soldier who had once fought these same people and seen his comrades fall beneath their blades of light. A man who should have felt nothing for her but hatred, and yet his eyes never left her as the sentence was proclaimed, his jaw clenched with the fury of one who understood too late that the universe was about to lose something far greater than an enemy, for when the elder who presided over the tribunal raised his staff and spoke in tones like stone grinding against stone, declaring her to be stripped of title, of name, and of future, cast into the eternal void for crimes against her bloodline and empire, the human felt a sickness in his chest, a crushing sense that this was not justice but the ritual slaughter of light itself, and when the chamber erupted in a chant of condemnation he did not join, instead moving through the crowd unnoticed until he reached the edge of the dais, where the stasis pod awaited, a coffin of crystal and steel humming with the cold energy of forever sleep, and the guards forced her toward it, their hands rough on her shoulders, their armor gleaming like predators surrounding prey, yet she did not resist, only turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for a single spark of kindness, and then she saw him, the human, standing apart, his uniform torn and stained, his presence absurdly fragile amid the grandeur of alien power, but their eyes met, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that neither empire nor law could touch, and when the guards pressed her into the pod and the transparent canopy began to descend, sealing her into her fate, the human moved, slipping past the last line of armored soldiers as though guided by something more than will, and before they could stop him his hand was on the glass, palm pressed to the barrier between them, and inside, her chained hand rose slowly, her fingers trembling yet sure, aligning with his through the transparent divide, the gesture small yet infinite in its weight, and the tribunal gasped, for it was an act of intimacy, of rebellion, of treason itself, and though the guards rushed forward to drag him away he held fast, his palm unmoving, his gaze locked on hers as though he could pour strength through the barrier and she could draw it into herself, and the elder's voice rose in fury, demanding the human be struck down, but before blades could cut, the pod sealed with a hiss and locked her away, and his hand was still there, pressed to the glass as the prison chamber's engines roared to life, the floor trembling with the force of destiny being sealed, and he shouted through the barrier though no sound could reach her ears, yet somehow she understood, her lips shaping words of defiance that mirrored his own. And then the pod was lifted, carried like a sacrificial offering down the corridor toward the launch bay, while he was dragged in chains of his own, soldiers pressing his arms behind him, their weapons threatening his life, but he did not care, for he had touched her hand even through the void of justice, and it was enough to ignite a fire that would not die, not even in the cold of the endless dark, and when at last the pod was placed within the airlock, tethered to the rail of fate, the princess inside lay motionless as if already carved into eternity, yet her hand remained pressed to the place where his had been, her breath shallow but steady, her body trembling against the unnatural stillness forced upon her, while beyond the gates of the lock the void waited, infinite and merciless, a tomb with no stone, a grave with no ground, and in the chaos of alarms and orders the human saw only her, only the fragile spark of defiance that had not yet been crushed, and he swore in the silence of his own heart that she would not drift alone into that night, for no law, no empire, no void itself could sever the bond that had been forged in a single moment of contact, and as the final barrier rose and the stars beyond yawned open like the mouth of eternity, the sentence was carried out, and the pod was launched, spinning into the abyss like a shard of broken light, but unseen by all, clinging to the shadows of the launch bay, the human prepared to follow, to cast himself into the same darkness, not as a prisoner but as her companion, a hand reaching through eternity to hold hers. And though the Empire celebrated its cruelty as victory, the true battle had only just begun, for in the cold silence between stars, love had already defied a galaxy's worth of chains. The void was not like the space that ships cut through with their engines blazing and their hulls warmed by artificial suns. It was not the familiar black scattered with stars that navigators charted and mapped. It was deeper, colder, and crueler, a silence so profound that even thought seemed to freeze within it. And when the pod carrying the alien princess was hurled into that abyss, spinning away from the airlock of her Empire's ship, her breath caught in her chest not because she feared death but because she felt, for the first time, truly erased, a life cast into emptiness where not even memory could follow. Yet as her eyes fluttered open against the stasis haze, she saw the impossible, a figure in the darkness, a shape tethered by a flickering line, drifting alongside her pod like a fragile moth in a storm. And as her vision cleared she recognized him, the human. His body wrapped in a failing exosuit designed for no such journey, his visor reflecting the faint glow of her prison's lights, and her heart that had remained calm in the face of Empire's judgment now stuttered with shock, for he had leapt with her, casting himself into oblivion without hesitation, and though she wanted to cry out, to scream for him to turn back, no sound existed here, only the vastness swallowing all. And yet when his gloved hand pressed again to the glass of her pod, her own hand rose unbidden, trembling against the inside barrier. And the despair that had begun to sink its claws into her chest loosened, because though she was chained and bound and sealed away, she was not alone, and in that truth lay a power greater than any weapon the Empire had ever forged. The human's oxygen levels were already dropping, she could see the faint flicker of his suit's warning lights, his breath shallow and ragged, yet his eyes remained locked on hers, clear and fierce even as frost began to edge across the inside of his visor. And she pressed her forehead to the glass as though to bridge the impossible gap, her body weak but her spirit unwilling to surrender, and so began their drift into eternity, two figures bound by nothing but touch and faith, hurtling together through the dead sea between galaxies. Hours passed like centuries, the void stretching endlessly, no beacon, no signal, no rescue, only the rhythmic pulse of his failing heart audible to himself and the slow, steady hum of her stasis pod, and in that rhythm they found a language, a silent communion. For when his hand faltered and began to slide from the glass, she tapped her fingers against it, and he responded with a faint shake of his head as though to reassure her, and when her strength waned and her eyes closed, his fist struck softly against the surface, jolting her awake with the stubborn insistence of one who refused to let her drift into sleep forever, and slowly their fear transformed into something greater, a bond that deepened with every heartbeat they shared in silence, as if the void itself could be held back by their will. The Empire's fleet had turned away, believing their sentence final, their vengeance complete, but the human knew better, knew that survival itself was rebellion, and as he clung to the side of her pod, every fiber of his being screamed with the pain of cold and hunger and dwindling breath, yet he refused to release her, for if the universe demanded her erasure, then he would carve his defiance into its very skin by being there, hand to hand until the end. At times his mind wandered, hallucinations flickering at the edges of his vision, memories of the battlefield where he first saw her tending to wounded humans despite her own army's scorn, the night he realized she was different, the spark of kindness in a galaxy where cruelty had become law, and in those visions he drew strength, whispering words he could not be sure she heard, yet somehow she did, for her lips moved against the glass, silent but certain, forming shapes that matched his own. Promises exchanged without sound, oaths born in silence yet more binding than any vow sworn aloud. The void pressed closer, a suffocating eternity, but together they pushed back, inventing rituals to mark the passage of time, a tap for every hour, a gesture for every flicker of hope, and though the human's body began to fail, his spirit grew sharper and she drew courage from him, her eyes blazing even as chains dug into her wrists, and in her heart she swore that if a chance for freedom came she would not waste it, not after the impossible loyalty he had given her. Days may have passed, or perhaps only hours, time in the void was a cruel illusion, but eventually the human's tether frayed, the thin line that had bound him to her pod snapping under invisible stress, and suddenly he was drifting, weightless and separate, spinning into the black, and for the first time a scream tore from her throat, though no one could hear it, her hands pounding against the glass, her luminous tears streaking down her face as his figure receded, his arm outstretched toward her even as distance grew, and she thought this was the true sentence, not exile but loss, not darkness but separation. Yet with the last reserves of his strength he ignited the thrusters of his failing suit, tiny bursts of light sputtering like dying stars, and he hurled himself forward, colliding once more with her pod, his body slamming against it hard enough to rattle the chains inside, his hand finding its place again, pressed to hers, and she wept with a relief so fierce it felt like breaking, because he had chosen her again, not once, not twice, but every moment he had breath, he chose to remain, and in that choice was a defiance more powerful than any empire's decree. Together they drifted still, beyond the reach of law, beyond the maps of navigators, and though the void sought to consume them, it could not, for two hearts beat against it, steady and stubborn, writing their story in silence and frost, and in the cold infinity of exile, love became their rebellion and hope their weapon, and while the universe turned its face away, the human and the alien princess held each other through darkness, preparing for whatever fate dared to come. The void had no mercy, no rhythm, no dawn, only the endless black stretching in every direction like the hollow breath of a dead god, and as the alien princess floated inside her crystalline coffin with the human clinging to it like a shadow carved into frost, time had ceased to exist, each moment bleeding into the next until days and nights meant nothing, and yet they endured, because endurance was all they had. His hand pressed to the glass as though it were the one truth left in the universe. Her own hand answering from the other side, trembling but constant, and though his body weakened with every breath, though his suit system stuttered with dying sparks, though hunger gnawed at him like knives and the cold seeped into his marrow, he never withdrew, not even when his vision blurred and the stars themselves seemed to vanish, for he had sworn that she would not drift alone into this graveyard eternity, and his promise was stronger than the void itself, but promises could not hold breath forever, and at last his oxygen reached its end, the flickering red light on his wrist pulsing its death knell, his lungs tightening as every gasp became fire, and the alien princess inside the pod felt the agony as though it were her own, her tears freezing into shining jewels against the glass, her lips forming silent pleas for him to let go, to save himself, but he shook his head slowly, pressing his palm harder against hers, his eyes soft with the kind of love that did not fear death, only absence, and then his movements stilled, his hands slipping as if the void had claimed him at last, his body floating gently away like a broken star drifting into night, and she screamed within the silence, slamming her fists against the stasis barrier, her chains rattling, her throat tearing with soundless cries, because the universe could not be so cruel as to give her the miracle of him only to snatch him away, and something within her broke, or perhaps something within her awoke, for the glow of her veins ignited, a radiant light pulsing through her skin like a storm reborn, the power of her bloodline that had been feared and suppressed by her empire roaring to life, and with a cry that tore through the very fabric of silence, the pod cracked, fissures of golden brilliance spreading outward like veins of lightning, and then it shattered, shards of crystal scattering into the void like dying stars, and she was free, her body trembling but alive, her chains burning away in the brilliance of her awakening, and she surged forward into the emptiness, her arms reaching, her hair whipping like a comet's trail behind her, until she caught him, the human whose eyes were closed, his breath still, his skin pale beneath the frost of death, and she pulled him into her embrace, cradling him against her chest as the tears streamed down her face. Her voice breaking into desperate words, ancient words of her people, words of light and fire, words that carried the power of her blood, words that begged the universe itself not to take him, and for a moment nothing answered, the void swallowing even her defiance. But then, as her forehead pressed to his, as her lips brushed against his in a kiss born of sorrow and fury and love, a spark lit between them, not of machine nor of science but of something deeper, something the Empire had always feared, for her power was not destruction but life, and in that kiss she gave him her breath, her fire, her will, pouring it into him as though to trade her soul for his, and his chest convulsed, his body shuddering, and then he coughed, a ragged sound that echoed like thunder in the silence, and his eyes fluttered open, dazed and wet with tears that froze instantly, and when he saw her, unchained and glowing, his lips curved into the faintest smile, and he whispered her name though he could not hear it, and she wept again, but this time in joy, clutching him tightly as though she could fuse their bodies into one to keep him from ever leaving again. Together they drifted, her power surrounding them in a cocoon of light, shielding them from the cold, from the vacuum, from despair, and though they were still adrift in the void, they were no longer powerless, for her awakening had sent a ripple through the silence, a beacon of impossible energy that called out across the black like a heartbeat in the dark, and far away, beyond the reach of their eyes, a ship heard it, an ancient colony vessel forgotten by empire charts, crewed by outcasts and survivors who knew how to listen to faint signals, and it turned toward them, engines burning against the cold, its lights piercing the abyss, and as it drew near the alien princess felt the resonance, the faint vibration of rescue, and she pressed her forehead once more to the humans, whispering words of promise, that whatever world awaited them next, whatever war or peace they faced, she would walk it hand in hand with him, for his defiance had become her salvation, and her love had become his breath, and nothing could unmake what they had forged together. When at last the ship's hull loomed like salvation itself, lights flooding the darkness, arms reaching to pull them inside, the human and the alien princess clung tighter to one another, their hands intertwined so firmly that no force in the universe could separate them, and as they collapsed onto the deck of the rescue vessel, gasping, trembling, their bodies broken yet alive, the onlookers fell silent, for the sight before them was not of two survivors but of something greater, a union of defiance and love that had endured the cruelty of empires and the emptiness of the void, and as she lay with her head against his chest, listening to his heart steady and strong once more, she smiled through her tears, because they had defeated the greatest weapon of all, not with armies or fire, but with a single touch, a single choice, and a love that had held its hand through darkness until the light returned.